about encouraging young women to go into the investment industry, investment management. Investment management is hugely important because where money is directed depends upon where business grows. It depends who is given the opportunity to start their businesses, who then has the opportunity to flourish. The whole shape of the economy really depends upon women playing their part within that industry and women therefore being able to shape the economic future of our world. So I will hand over to Tilly to talk to you about her journey and about how excited she is about her profession. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here today. It's especially great to be here in person. I know you've all been coming to school, but I've been sitting at home for the past 4 weeks, so it's very exciting to be back out in the real world. So my name's Tilly Franklin, and my job is I'm the Chief Investment Officer of the Cambridge University Endowment Fund. What does that mean? Cambridge University has about £3.5 billion of investment assets which we manage, and we manage those on behalf of the university and its associated colleges and trusts. And our objective is to invest to deliver a return to the university. So every year we send about £100 million of funding back to the university from the investment returns that we've generated. And that goes towards funding the university's teaching and research activities. And put another way, I know these numbers maybe sound very large and sort of incomprehensible, but we basically subsidise about £4,000 per student of additional funding because a Cambridge education is structurally loss-making, so tuition fees aren't actually sufficient to finance the cost of delivering the education to students. And the way that we invest is that we find specialist external fund managers all over the world in various of different pockets of the investment landscape, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. We partner with them to deliver these investment returns. So in a normal world, not this year, I get to travel all over the world, to Asia, to the US, all different places, and meet amazing people who are putting money behind some of the most interesting ideas in technology and finance. And it's a really huge privilege to do this work. For me, I've always been an investor for many years, and I really enjoy sort of the commercial activity in investing, but to get to put that towards a charitable endeavour is a unique privilege. And in the UK, there aren't that many comparable institutions, but there are a few. So Oxford also has a reasonably large endowment. The Wellcome Trust, which is a scientific research foundation, does, and the church also does. But those are really the only organisations of our kind. In the US, where schools and universities are much richer, there are a lot more similar organisations. And as a separate note, I'm also the founder of a charity called GAIN, which you'll see here, our logo is on the presentation. And I set up GAIN specifically to encourage more young women to get into careers in investment management by providing both information and access. And you can find out more on our website, gainuk.org. We also have a LinkedIn channel and an Instagram channel, which is you can find under Girls Are Investors. And we're also running an internship program now for undergraduates to get work experience, and we're hoping to provide insight days next year for sixth formers. So hopefully that we can have more dialogue through GAIN. So today I'm going to cover two things. First of all, a bit about me. How did I get here? What was my career journey? And then secondly, what is investing? It may be a term that sounds a bit incomprehensible to some. So I'll explain a little bit why it's so important to us as a society, expanding on the High Mistress's comments, and also why it's a really great career. And I'll try not to talk for too long. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Hopefully many of you will want to find out more. So before I talk about investing, let me tell you a little bit more about me. And I think the most important thing to say is that when I was in your shoes, I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to do as a career. In fact, I didn't even know what investment management was, let alone endowment management, which is what I do now. And I think if you take nothing else away from today's talk, I think it's really important to understand that it's okay if you don't know what you want to do. I think it can be very stressful looking towards the future and thinking about different options. Of course, if you do have a particular driving ambition, that's absolutely great. But it's also great if you don't, because then you have a lot of different options that are open to you. And to me, the most important thing that you can do career-wise is to throw yourself into something. It could be anything. And that's really the only way to find out what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, and what you're good at and what you're not good at, because what you enjoy and what you're good at professionally might actually be very different from what you enjoy and what you're good at school, and that can be very exciting. So I really see career development as almost like an evolutionary process for anyone who studied biology, where you test out different things and learn along the way, and that's definitely what happened to me. So when I was here at St. Paul's, I was very good at English. That was my favourite subject, and so I was encouraged to study English, which I did. I went to Cambridge, and then because I continued to do well, I was strongly encouraged to go and do a PhD. And of course, it's wonderful as well if you're very academically motivated. So I'm married to a professor of economics, and I obviously work for an academic institution. But academia wasn't the right career path for me, and I only discovered that during my first year of my PhD. I went off to study in the US, and it was a great experience, and I met some wonderful people, but I found the life very solitary after the more kind of convivial environment of undergraduate study, and it was a kind of difficult time because I had to kind of rethink things altogether, because I'd planned to go ahead, do this PhD, become an academic, teach, and so on. And so I just talked to a number of my friends, and I asked about what other people that I knew were doing, and I ended up going into management consulting, which is pretty different from English literature. But a number of people advised me that consulting was just a really good way to get real-world experience and to get a grounding in business and learn about what was going on in the real economy, which was also something that had always interested me. And from there on, I literally just followed my nose. I had 2 or 3 different jobs in business, working in different companies, before I happened upon investing. And each time I was just trying to find a new role where it offered a little bit more of the things that I most enjoyed and a little bit less of the things that I didn't enjoy. And eventually, just through that process of trial and error, really, I realized that what I liked most was thinking about the future potential of new products and services that the companies I work for or my clients when I was a consultant were creating. I enjoyed analysing, researching, looking at qualitative information, surveys, quantitative information as well, and then forecasting how significant and how profitable those products could be. But even at that point, I didn't know what investing was. And it wasn't until I went to business school. I studied at LBS, London Business School here in London, and I finally actually took some classes in investing. And I realized that that was what investing was all about. It was about using research, using analytical tools to forecast what was going to happen in the future within companies, within the economy, within technologies, within new product development, and so on. And that was what I really enjoyed. And so I then got my first investing job at a private equity firm called Apax Partners, and that was when I was 28. So it's taken me basically 10 years from sort of where you're sitting today to figuring that out, although it was a very interesting journey. And then I've had 3 different investment jobs since then. The first was with Apax Partners, a private equity firm. Private equity firms buy whole companies, and companies that are not listed on a stock exchange, private companies, that's why it's called private equity, and they try to improve those businesses to make them more profitable and then sell them on either by listing them on a stock exchange or selling them to another party. From Apax, where I worked for 8 years, I then went to work for a family investment office. I worked for one of the world's wealthiest families for the past 12 years, advising them on their investment portfolios. And then I took up this job at the beginning of this year. So interesting time to take a new job. But I'm happy to, I won't go into the different jobs in any more detail, but I'm really happy to answer questions about those specific opportunities, or indeed about anything or everything at the end. So now I'll move on to talk a bit more about investing. So what is investing? Who here knows what investment management is? Okay. I can't believe that none of you do. Let me ask a different question. Who has ever watched The Dragon's Den, Shark Tank, any programs of that nature? Okay, so maybe about a third of you have watched those types of TV programs. So if you have watched Dragon's Den or Shark Tank or any programs like that, you already know what investment management is. It's basically like being in the dragon's den every day as a dragon, deciding which companies to put money behind, deciding which opportunities to back. There are some differences, though, between what I do, which is institutional investment management, and being a dragon in the dragon's den. Obviously, we're not sort of on TV, we're not popularizing our activity, but another big difference is we get to invest much, much larger sums of money. So the typical investment that I would make in my job today is probably around $50 million, or about £40 million. The other difference, of course, is I'm not investing my own money, so that's kind of why the amounts are so much larger. The dragons are investing their own capital. But really, the fundamental activity is the same. So I think you probably all understand a lot more about it than you think. And if you look at this slide, I've literally looked up the dictionary definition of investing, as a good English student would do. I won't read it out, but simply put, investing is all about using money to generate an increase in value. It's that simple. And we call that an investment return in the industry. So if you buy something for £10, you hopefully get more than £10, £20, let's say, just like the dragons are hoping to do in the Dragon's Den. But more broadly, as you can see from the definition at the bottom, investing is also about devoting time to achieving a goal. So it's not just about the money. So we're all investors all the time, whether we like it or not. Every time we decide to devote our time to studying a particular thing or buying a particular thing, we're investing in our future. If we're buying new clothes, we're investing in our appearance. So we're all investors every day. So I'd encourage you to just think about that next time you decide to spend time on a new activity or spend money on a new purchase, or even investing your money for the future. Putting your money in your bank account is investing in your ability to purchase something else in the future. So I'll talk a bit about who are the investors. So as the High Mistress mentioned, investment is fundamental to our economy. So, for example, investment drives economic growth. If a new chain of retail stores wants to open, somebody needs to fund the store refurbishments, the opening program, purchasing inventory that can then be sold on. Same thing for e-commerce. Same for any company that wants to expand. They need money to set up, because it takes some time between setting up a business and actually gaining customers, gaining income. So investment drives economic growth. It determines employment, whether new jobs are created, and in fact, critically, how wisely both the government and business decides to invest coming out of the COVID recession will determine how successfully the UK economy actually recovers from all the difficulties that we've experienced this year. And investment could be important to you in the future, whether you end up working in the industry or not. Investment is all around us, as we can see from this slide. So, for example, if somebody in your family has a pension, or if you eventually have a pension, somebody is managing that pension plan, somebody is investing that money, and if they don't do a good job, there won't be enough money to pay the pension in the future when you or your relative comes to retire. Universities have investments, such as the ones that I manage, which go to subsidize a better standard of education. Insurance companies run investment portfolios, so if you have mobile phone insurance, let's say, somebody in the insurance company is deciding how to invest all the premiums that you pay in, so that, again, when you have a claim, there's enough money to pay it out, and so on and so forth. Of course, people have savings. They want to invest them. They want to get more money back in the future than they put in. And countries also often have investments as well, which are called sovereign wealth funds. And so they're investing in different types of investments. I won't go into in detail now. But so all these different entities are deciding every day what they do with their money, and that affects us all. And I do want to make one point here, which is just that investment management is not the same as investment banking. So a lot of people get put off. They think that the two things are the same. They have the same word in their name, so fair enough. And investment banking is also a really interesting career, but people associate that a lot of the time with long hours, perhaps some kind of difficult cultural aspects. And the way to characterize the difference between the two, for me, is quite simple. So let's say you're buying a house. If you are the investor, then you're the homeowner, so you're actually going to own that house. Or if you're perhaps a bank, you might be lending money to fund a mortgage. So the bank and the homeowner are the investors. The investment banker is like the real estate agent, what's it called, estate agent. So the investment bankers are facilitating buying and selling between companies or between other actors in the economy. And that's kind of the easiest way to characterize the difference between the two. So these are the entities that are investing in the economy, but who are the actual people? Who is doing this activity? You might have a stereotypical idea of who they might be, but these are some of my former colleagues, some of my friends in the industry. And although investment management has a reputation for suffering from a lack of diversity, this is really, really changing. And the people who work in the industry today, people that you might end up working with in the future, might be very different from your impression. And many firms are hiring straight out of university, so it's something that you can get experience in at an early stage of your career, much earlier than I did. And why is that important? The reason that the industry is focusing so much today on diversity is that numerous surveys have shown that teams with more diverse participants almost always make better decisions than teams that have just one type of person. And the more different axes of diversity, as you can see on this chart, which is really just a graphical illustration of this fact, that the more different axes of diversity you have, the better decisions are made. And it makes sense intuitively. I mean, if everybody on a team comes from a similar background or has a similar perspective, you're just going to end up with a narrower set of inputs to a decision. You're going to have a less rich set of information to take into account. And I'm sure you would have observed that on teams that you might have worked with at school, on teams in sport, on teams that you're involved with in extracurricular activities, and it just makes sense. And there are numerous initiatives within the investment industry that are being set up to try to address this, including GAIN, which is the charity that I founded, but that there are also a number of others as well. So I'll move on again to talk a bit more about, why do we care about investment? Why should we care? I'll try to make this a bit more interactive. So who in the audience has an iPhone? Anyone? Yes? Who's a tiny bit addicted to their iPhone? Yes, so some honest people out there. So where does the iPhone come from? Does anybody know? Or any guesses? Yes, it comes from Apple. That's very good. And where does Apple come from, though? So where does it originally come from? I'll tell you the story of how Apple was founded. In the 1970s, some of you may know this story, there was a young entrepreneur called Steve Jobs. He dropped out of college, and he had this idea. He was interested in computers. Now, in the 1970s, and if anyone studies computer science or has read books about it, computers were basically about half the size of this room, and you had to be an electrical engineer to even consider using a computer. But Steve Jobs had this idea of making a computer into a really beautiful consumer product. It was a completely radical, unheard of idea at the time. And in 1977, he got his first investment. He raised capital of $250,000, so a lot, from an individual wealthy guy in California, a guy called Mike Markula. And in return for his $250,000, Mike Markula got to own a third of Apple. So the whole value of the whole thing was just under $1 million. If you roll forward to today, Apple is the most valuable company in the world. It's worth, last time I checked, over $2 trillion. Yes, that's $2,000 billion. So that turned out to be a pretty good investment for Mike Markula. The company isn't just really, really valuable and successful and the maker of addictive technology products that we all love, but it's also created about 125,000 jobs around the world, all sorts of jobs, from retail jobs, at one end all the way through to product design, computer engineering jobs at the other end. So it's been a huge success story. And so I'd like to ask you, if you were a wealthy individual, I have to go into a time machine and go back to the 1970s, and you had the opportunity to invest in Apple, who in the audience thinks that they would have actually invested $250,000 behind this young college dropout? Come on, there's got to be somebody, there's got to be some brave soul in the audience. Anybody think you might have considered it seriously, at least? Yes? Okay, tell me why did you put your hand up?
Because it was an interesting idea, and I think although it wasn't, I mean, who knows, and it was a lot of money at the time, but I don't know how wealthy
Markula, yeah.
I don't know how wealthy he was, but if it wasn't much, like it would depend on how
Yeah.
much he had to spare, and if it was just a drop in the ocean for him to just say, oh yeah, see what happens. I mean, why not?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So in case anyone didn't hear, the comment was it was a really novel idea, it had huge potential, and possibly if Markula was very wealthy, this $250,000, although it was a lot, he might have been able to lose that. He might have had enough money that if he lost the money, it wouldn't have completely negatively affected his life. So by definition, only one person in the audience would have even considered investing in Apple, so everybody else wouldn't have considered it. So now somebody needs to give me the counter argument. So somebody, why would you not consider it?
Well, personal computers hadn't been a thing, so you couldn't have known like the extent of their popularity or
Mm-hmm.
the amount. So investing 250,000 is like assuming a lot of risk,
Mm-hmm.
an idea that hadn't worked before.
Yeah. Okay, great point. So just in case anyone didn't hear again, the counter-argument was personal computing didn't really exist. We had no idea how big of a product category this could become, and hence the investment was incredibly risky. It was a lot of money, so why take that risk? And it's always really interesting to me to have this conversation because some of you, a very small number of you, might have invested in Apple and others wouldn't. But you're both right. There is no right and wrong answer in this industry in a way, because obviously anyone who did invest at the time would have made a huge amount of money, but the investment was really, really risky, and Mike could have just as easily lost all his money. So the investment industry needs to have people with different risk appetites. We need to have people who will go into these very early stage, unproven technology companies, or we would never have any product innovation, we would never have any technological innovation in the economy. But we also need people who are more cautious, because if your pension's being invested, you probably don't want 100% of it to be put into these types of things. You want it to have a balanced risk profile. You want to be sure that when you retire, you're going to have enough income to fund your retirement. And just as importantly, I want to spend one last moment talking about responsible investment, because I think another misperception commonly held about this industry is that it's all about making money. It is about making money, and that's very important to some people, including charities. But also as an investor, you have a big, broader responsibility, and that can be hugely rewarding. So, I'm not only responsible for looking after the university's money, but I'm also responsible for ensuring that it's invested in a way that the university can be proud of. And this actually makes business sense, because often commercial and responsible goals go together. So companies which behave well, for example, are more likely to be loved by their customers, and they're also less likely to end up in the doghouse with regulators, for example. And what's great about being an investor is you can actually drive a lot of positive changes. For example, if you're a private equity investor, you often sit on the board of the companies that you invest in. Or if you're an investor in the stock market, you get to vote about important resolutions, important decisions that companies are making. And by doing those things, you can hold companies to account on really important issues like climate change, also like gender equity, so equal pay, for example. Without investors, companies would just go out of business. They wouldn't have enough money to fund their operations, so we really do have a voice. And an example that's come out quite recently is that at Cambridge, at the endowment, we just recently announced a new approach to environmental sustainability, and we announced an ambition to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions from our investment portfolio by 2038, which is significantly ahead of broader governmental goals, and we're really, really excited about putting this into practice, and I'm happy to speak more about that if anyone's interested. So just to wrap up, finally, to come back to the beginning, why work in investing? I promised to talk about why it's a great career, and it's been a great career for me. When I was at school, as I mentioned, I loved English, and I went on to study English, but my other favourite subject was maths. And I always really struggled with the need to choose. You know, we had this system in the UK where you kind of need to be a humanities person or a science person in many cases, and I really struggled with that. And investing blends both of those things. So obviously we do look at numbers, so we look at the past performance of companies and funds and how the returns that they've generated stack up. But it's also all about the people. Are the people I'm investing with good people? Are they going to do the right thing for the university, for our portfolio? Do they have a unique set of skills and insights that's going to allow them to actually generate a better set of investment returns than just investing in the stock market broadly defined? And, you know, a second point is independence of thought. I was quite contrary at times, and I still am at times, and I love getting into arguments and debates. And investment management rewards people who are prepared to take a different perspective on things. If you had the same view as everybody else, you're not going to sort of outperform the market. So it really rewards individuality of thought. Another really great thing about the job is you never stop learning. I've been doing this job for 20 years, albeit in 3 different firms, and I'm still learning something every single day. I normally get to travel a lot. I've been all over the world. In fact, it's been a bit of a relief this year to travel a bit less, but I'm looking forward to getting back out again on the road, hopefully next year. And I've also achieved financial independence, which is something that people don't often talk about. I think it's often really underestimated by women, but it's extremely liberating to be financially independent. Having said that, I'm also happily married and I have 2 wonderful teenage daughters. So all in all, I'm having a tremendous amount of fun doing this job, and I hope I've inspired some of you to consider it. But in the meantime, happy to take any questions from the audience. Thanks. Yes.
This might be a massive question. In fact, it is a massive question. But if you could advise the government as to what they should invest in now, you know, in terms of getting an economic recovery, what would you tell them to do?
That is a very difficult question. I'm not a macroeconomist or an economic policy maker. You should actually ask my husband, because he is a macroeconomist. But I would say that at a high level, I can't sort of give the whole answer to that. I would say 2 things, though. I would advise the government to invest in education, because I think in future the economy is going to be much more skills-based. So as we all know, technology is automating a lot of more routine jobs in the economy. So the UK will only succeed as an economic actor in the future if we have a highly skilled workforce, which doesn't really seem to be something that we're investing in. Obviously, St Paul's is an exception to that, but looking at the economy more broadly, that doesn't necessarily seem to be a huge focus at the moment. And the other thing I would encourage them to do, which I actually think they are doing, is to invest in the UK being a green technology leader, and being a leader not just in actually producing clean energy, where we actually are a global leader already, which is encouraging, but in becoming a leader in the technologies that support the energy transition, because having a successful energy transition or not is an economic imperative for the whole world. So we could become a big exporter of technology in that area. So those are just two things, but I don't have the whole answer, I'm afraid. Yes, over there.
Have you ever made any serious mistakes when investing, and if so, how did you come back from that?
Sure, that's a really good question. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the first question. So the question was, have I ever made any serious mistakes, and how did I come back from it? So I have made some catastrophic mistakes, and indeed in a couple of times in my earlier career, I lost all the money that I invested in something, and millions and millions of pounds. And how did I come back from it? I think the key thing to remember about this job is, there's no successful investor who's never lost money. If you're going to make hundreds and hundreds of investments in your career, you have to take risk. So, some of those risks are going to pay off and some of them aren't. The key is to have insight So insight kind of loads the dice. If you're just taking risk randomly, you're just basically rolling dice. But if you have differentiated knowledge or insights or skills, you basically load the dice in your favor so that you make money more than half of the time. But, you know, for example, if I basically invested in one thing where I invested £100 million and made 10 times my money, and another thing where I invested in 100 million and lost all the money, I've still made 800 million pounds of return. So, you know, it's kind of okay to lose money sometimes, as long as you don't lose money all the time. And I think that's something actually that puts a lot of people off because they're afraid of taking risks. I have to say this is probably the most risk-averse audience I've ever spoken to, where only one person would even consider an investment in Apple. But it's okay to take risk. It's okay to fail at times, as long as that's in service of the broader endeavor of success over a long period of time. Yes?
You mentioned your environmental goal, the 2038 thing. Are you concerned that by sort of trying to have the portfolio be more environmentally oriented, you might also lose kind of geographical diversity, by which I mean that, generally speaking, environmental kind of goals are more of a developed world thing rather than a developing world thing. I don't know how much of a role that plays really in Cambridge.
Sure, that's a good point. So the question was, by pursuing environmental goals, could we sacrifice geographic diversity, given that many developed economies are more advanced in terms of sort of the clean energy transition than other economies? So the goal that we have at Cambridge is to achieve this net zero position by 2038 without sacrificing either investment returns or diversification in our portfolio. So I think a lot of people in investment take an approach that says, well, I just don't want to own anything that's polluting. So they'll take a sort of selection of investments and then they just screen out, you know, energy production, transportation, utilities, and so on. So any of the sort of so-called dirty industries. I think that's a bit of a cop-out, to be honest, because even though your portfolio might then look wonderfully sort of clean and consistent with the energy transition, that hasn't stopped the emissions from actually being emitted into the environment, because those companies still exist. Those companies are still operating. They're still emitting. So what we're trying to do is to actually influence the companies to become better environmental stewards. And we're drawing on the resources of Cambridge to do that. So I'm lucky that, you know, it's not just me and my team. We also have a number of academic institutions, one of which, called the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, specifically focuses part of its activity on training company boards and company management to manage their companies in a more environmentally efficient way. And it's actually been shown in a study that came out of Harvard University recently that companies doing the same type of economic activity, so let's say a chemicals company, chemicals manufacturer, for the same activity, some companies generate 10 times the emissions of other companies just through better, more efficient management and better stewardship. So what we're trying to do is to encourage the companies, the underlying companies in our portfolio, to be on the sort of better end of that spectrum. And we have some time, not a huge amount of time, but we have some time to do that. And we do invest in the emerging markets, and but I have to say, actually, just because of the nature of our activity, it tends to be, for example, in China, we tend to be more invested in tech companies. We're not typically investing in utility companies, and that's mainly because those companies tend to often be owned by the government, and they tend to not be necessarily managed for purely economic reasons. So there's other reasons why we're less exposed to sort of the biggest emitters in the emerging economies. But it's a good question. Yes.
So on the subject of ethical investing, do you think the industry overall is sufficiently ethical? And if not, what can be done to make it ethical, to deal with some of these challenges?
Yeah, so the question was, is the industry overall sufficiently ethical? And if it isn't, what can be done to change that? I do think the industry has been primarily financially focused for most of its history, and I think that was probably appropriate, given that, you know, again, many of the proceeds go to funding people's pensions, so it's not as if it's just sort of making rich people richer. But just in the last few years, I've observed a huge groundswell of change, and I think it is a lot to do with increasing awareness of the climate emergency and people waking up and saying that we can't just sit by and watch this play out and not take action, not use our influence as investors and stewards of capital to make change. And so I do think that change is occurring. I think the industry is becoming more focused on responsibility and ethical behavior, but I think the best way to change it is to get into the industry and change it yourself. I mean, I'm doing what I can, but it needs more people. You know, it needs more people who care about a multiplicity of different outcomes to come in and change the world. Yes.
What aspects of the business do you kind of take into account for investing into it? Because I think, like, especially when you're thinking of investing in the 1970s and funding some young college dropout, there are quite a few kind of more kind of negative aspects of that and much more risky. So you kind of assume that much more luck is coming into play than kind of intelligence and looking at the specific factors that would make this company successful. So, like, to what extent do you kind of look at the specific aspects of the business and what aspects and how much does luck kind of come into play?
Sure. I think, so the question was, what factors do we take into account when we're looking at companies, and especially when looking at kind of very technology-oriented companies that may be founded by young computer scientists and the like, how much of it is about luck and what other factors come into play? So those are two questions, really, so I'll answer them in reverse order. So in terms of sort of funding young people with ideas in tech, and you mentioned that things might be very different in the 1970s, but that kind of activity still goes on today. In fact, it's much more common today for very young technology entrepreneurs to get funding, especially in California, where there's a huge ecosystem in what's called the venture capital industry. But also here, there's investors here who, in the UK and all over Europe and in China especially, who invest in very, very early stage technologies, invest in companies that have completely unproven concepts with no revenues, no sales. And very often those kind of companies are actually founded by young people because they're often founded by people coming out of computer science labs or other types of scientific backgrounds. Biotech innovation is another example of that. And I think actually, in a way, when a concept is underpinned by science, and most of the people who do that type of investing have a scientific background themselves, so they're not just making a random bet, they're actually able to evaluate the science, they're able to say, well, this molecule actually does have a better chance of, curing this particular type of cancer, let's just say, than the existing molecules that are in circulation in the pharmaceutical industry. And so when there's a scientific kind of underpinning, then you basically just have to sort of go through the steps of getting the product developed, approved by regulators and so on. And so, of course, there's many, many risks that come into play, but it's not a random risk in that way. I think looking at later stage businesses, there's a lot more data to go on, so you can analyze a lot, when the company pursued a similar initiative in the past, was it successful or not, so do their plans for the future stack up? I have to say, I don't anymore invest directly in companies. I used to do that when I was back in Apex Partners, in the private equity firm that I first joined. Nowadays, because our portfolio is so large and so diversified, I'm actually finding fund managers in different sort of parts of the world or different specialist areas, and then I'm giving capital to those individuals. They then go out and deploy it into particular companies, because there's no way I could pick the best, early stage tech company in China. So I need to find somebody in China who's a local person who knows the local business landscape, the local culture, and so on. So when I meet those people, and people often say, oh, you're just investing in funds, so what's the job? You just give money to funds. Well, I could do that, but I probably wouldn't be employed for very long. What I'm looking for when I invest in funds is I want to find fund managers who have a particularly unique set of insights. So that, for example, so just to continue on a theme, one of the funds that we have a successful investment with does invest in early stage drug development. And it's all staffed by ex-PhDs in medical science. They also have some finance people on the team as well, and they work together to basically figure out which of the developments that are most likely to be successful from a scientific point of view, and then helping those companies to develop from a financial point of view. And in my judgment, that team has the best combination of those two skills that's available in the market. So we do a huge amount of research, interviewing them, talking to people that they've worked with in the past, going through all their research notes, making sure that they actually do have the insights that they claim to have before we make those decisions. Any more questions? Oh, yes, sorry, you had a question earlier. Oh, no. I think we've got one last question in the back, yeah? If we have time.
I was just wondering, small question. You were talking about the people who invest having a background in the thing they're investing in. Do you think there's been a movement away from sort of hiring economics graduates, for example, towards more kind of science-oriented fields?
Not necessarily, because I think I just use those examples because it's easy to understand, the link between a scientific background and investing in science. But there's lots of people not investing in science. So lots of people are investing in mature companies, in let's say services companies, retail companies. People invest in the debt of companies, and then you've got to think much more about the downside risk of losing your money if you're investing in debt. So no, people are still hiring a lot of economics graduates as well. And then, what tends to happen is you might start off your career in a more generalist role, and then you pick up expertise along the way, and then you can become a specialist in something later on, and you don't need to know what that is at the beginning. As in my case, you might just find out through trial and error what aspect of the investment landscape most interests you. So in our team, we just recruited our first investment analyst, and that person just graduated in economics last summer. So there's lots of different routes in. It doesn't really matter. I think the key thing is just to be really interested in investing, to be passionate about learning, and to be open-minded and to be prepared to sort of learn as you go.
I just want to say, kind of on behalf of everyone here, a massive thank you for coming in and speaking to us about your hugely impressive career and for sharing your kind of insight into the world of investment. I think no matter what career path lies ahead of us, we've all learned a great deal. I mean, Ivan had never considered a difference between investment banking and investment management, and there's all these phrases and concepts that we hear all the time that you've really helped to clarify, so thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm sure you didn't know you had the biggest risk appetite of anybody in your year group, so well done to you as well. Thank you both. Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure. All the best.